Hello, and welcome to Towle Talks. Today we start talking about the models. For review, please make sure that database is set up like we did last lecture. We set up the Hoot database with different foreign key constraints. It's vital that's up before you start this, because this is going to build off of that. So the models are one of the more challenging aspects of a web application using MVC, because the model is probably one of the first things you're going to do, but it's actually hard to interact and test with it. So today we're going to just make the models, and I'll show you how to simply test and make sure the functionality is working. At this stage, it can seem very embryonic because you don't have any views, you probably aren't going to have any forms, and your controller functions are going to be very simplistic just in order to test out the models. However, it's vital that we get this point right. Consider it like you building a house. Like we talked about last lecture, the digging out of the foundation or the hole for the house, that's setting up the database, and that's the most important. The model, you can, if it's not a good practice, but if you need to, you can go back and change the model fairly easy. Changing the database, not so much. So the first thing we have to figure out is how to get CodeIgniter as a whole, or more importantly, the model, to connect to the database. That's the first leg of the journey, so to speak, that we're going to deal with right now. Let's talk about models. Models deal with getting information to and from the database and to the controller. So they're basically going to be the transporter that handles the details of trying to get into the database and getting it from the database. Usually the model is going to provide essentially a CRUD, which is create, read, update, and delete. But they can also provide different functions that allow the controller easier access to the database. Maybe the controller wants a list of all users but doesn't care about anything else. Maybe the the controller wants the top 10 messages and nothing else. The model can also have functionalities like what I call abstract functions. Not abstract in the sense of software engineering, but more abstract in functionality than the simple MySQL queries or complex MySQL queries that give a lot more detail for results. So we'll talk a little bit about that, but that's essentially what the model is going to do. And it's not going to worry too much about input, or it's not going to worry about what's happening. It's just going to be basically someone that gets information from a filing cabinet and brings it to someone else. So this is our current graph, what we were working on before. We were working on this stuff over here. Right now, the first thing we have to do is we have to configure CodeIgniter to connect to the database. So we haven't even talked about the model yet, but this whole thing, this would be CodeIgniter if I had like another box around here. And then we have to get CodeIgniter to talk to the database. So we're going to talk about that first. Hello. So today is going to be one of the more challenging videos of the set. Now, assuming you haven't had any real problems up to now, we've got the database set up for this new application we're going to make called Hoot. So we're going to be using this application for the next couple lectures. This lecture is going to be on the models of the model system of MVC. This lecture, unfortunately, has a very embryonic feel to it because it's awkward. It's not quite enough to get a full application up and running, but it takes a lot of things just to get set up just in order to test it. So it's a very awkward stage. However, it's vital that we get the model correct or pretty much working before we move on and go any further with our web application. So last lecture I talked about databases and different why it was important to design them and make sure we had a good design for the database. Again, it's not supposed to be a database class, but something to keep in mind. So here we're going to start connecting CodeIgniter to the database, and we're going to start setting up our models. So again, I extracted my CodeIgniter folder. I called it Hoot. Here is just the extracted. When I'm extracting it, I'm getting a double folder, so I just take out one level of the folders. That's why mine is right underneath Hoot. If you have two levels, that's fine. You just have to type in another folder level for your URL. Now, the first thing we're going to do is we are going to open up our database. A couple of changes we're going to make real quickly, they're very important, is first of all, we're going to open up our Hoot database, and we are going to click on the Hoot table, and we're going to change, let's go to structure. I have things here, don't worry about it. You won't. We're going to change this date column. So right now you probably have date. We're going to change this to date mod. And you want to be careful when using the word date in your table. It's a reserved word for MySQL. So please make sure this is date mod. This will stand for date modified. That's one change we're going to make. The other thing we're going to change is under likes. If you have, I think we changed this last time. If you didn't, go to structure and we'll say date liked for the likes. So we don't want to have any, if you have any columns named date, you need to change them. The next thing we're going to do is we are going to create a user. So up here we can click on the server itself, and this will bring up the server, and we're going to go to user accounts. Do not, and I learned this the hard way, do not name your user for your database to be the same as the database itself, because if you delete that user, you also wipe the database. So, or just drop it. So I made a user called Hoot user, and we'll just talk about, we'll just look at this user. I'm going to get an error saying I already have a user, don't worry about it. So database, we'll come back to this. You just go to make a new user. I called the user Hoot user, and then what I would recommend is making it localhost, not any. I had some weird connectivity issues. I'm not sure if that could have been a myriad things on my side, so I'm not sure exactly what was going on there, but I would just do localhost for now. And then the password, I called it Hoot, H-O-O-T. Obviously, it's not very protected, but hey, you can also generate one. And then I'm not going to actually make the user here because I already have it, but this is how I set it up. So you go to the database, the server itself, user accounts, new user, and then you're going to just say Hoot user, localhost, and then text field. I just did password Hoot, and you retype Hoot. Now, once you have that and you created it, I would give it on the global permissions. I just gave it everything, so it gives you this screen. Except you do not require a SSL, so we don't need this. But we have to have. We can get all or these three things anyway. Don't worry about resource limits. It's not important. We'll hit go there. It will say that. On database, and this is the part I almost missed. Here you need to select the Hoot database and then hit go, and then it'll give you a similar similar option to the previous or the global page, and again give grant all privileges to the user for Hoot. So once you do those three or four things, you will have a user that the web application can use to connect to your database. Generally speaking, and I don't think it'd be it's not really kind of a no-brainer, but you don't really want your web application accessing your MySQL with simply root. It's a little bit dangerous. Now, after we have that set up, we have to try to connect to it. So what we're going to do is we're going to open up our database system, or not database, pardon me. We're going to go to our file system, go to htdocs, and go to our Hoot web application folder. Again, you'll have to extract this from CodeIgniter. Just rename it as Hoot, and then underneath the application folder and then underneath the config folder, you will have all of the different configs. And this time we're going to have to open up database.php. Now once you open up database.php, it'll give you a bunch of comments on what's going on here. It's not nearly as complex as it looks like. I changed this PC Connect to false. I don't think that was my problem, but that did seem to help. So you may or may not need to change that to false. Basically, though, the four things you have to change are these things here. So the local host is your host name. You don't have to worry about a DSN. The username is Hoot user or whatever you type there. Again, hopefully it was not Hoot. I was having connectivity issues with that. So Hoot user is mine, and the password's Hoot. Again, one flaw here, this is in plain text. So that's another reason you do not want these files exposed on the internet, which they shouldn't be if you follow proper procedure. But this is a plain text password, and then the database will be Hoot if you named it Hoot. And then the a database driver can be MySQLi. I believe that the MySQL for CodeIgniter is now deprecated, so I believe if you're using MySQL, just use MySQLi. You shouldn't have to change anything else. Again, I set this to false, but I don't think that actually helped me. So I mean, you can if you want. So that once we save that, now our CodeIgniter application can connect to our database. All right, so hopefully we've got the CodeIgniter speaking with the model or the database. If you're having errors, you can try to debug it, look online. Hopefully you shouldn't have any errors as long as you follow those instructions I said. Now we have to get the model or the controller to talk to the model. It's the last leg of the trip, the last piece of the MVC architecture that we really haven't dealt with or we talked about, and that is how to get information from the controller to the model and vice versa. So once we have CodeIgniter talking to the database, we're going to need a constructor, or we're going to need to create a model. And in order to create a model, we need a constructor. We need to initialize the database. We're going to have to figure out how to write information, update information, and get specific information based on certain conditions. Also in this list, I should say delete, but I don't actually do delete in this video. So here we see that now we have completed the MVC architecture. We just finished figuring out how to get the database connected to the CodeIgniter. We actually did the database last lecture. So the last missing piece really is getting from a controller to the model. And now we're going to figure out how we can create a library of functions in our models for our controllers to call to get information from the database to and from the database. So this is the last leg, if you will, of the MVC model we have to talk about. So last time we set up the database in order to connect to CodeIgniter. Let's look down and now let's talk about making the model. Again, the model is going to be probably the first code you write and probably will make or break your web application. Luckily, the model can be changed easier than a database. So if you've done a good job on the database and maybe you don't finish the model or don't quite set the model up the best optimal way, that's easier to change than having a bad database. So assuming you have the database set up, that's good. The model is not quite as important, but still it acts as a foundation. So jumping into it, we're going to create a new file. I'll just save something to show you where I'm putting this. We're going to go to our web application folder underneath htdocs. We'll go to our Hoot. We'll go to application, and then underneath application we'll go to models. Now all models here are going to be usable by the controllers. Again, the Hoot the models have the same naming convention that the controllers do. The first letter must be capitalized, and the name of the file, excluding the .php, must be the name of the class. So I'm not going to actually save that, but I was going to show you where that was. I'm going to go through one model very slowly and the other two other models quickly, and then we'll just today we're just going to demo and make sure each function is working. We'll talk about how we use these and how we how we put the program together a little bit later. But just for now, we want to get the models up. So I'm going to show you one way, and hopefully I'll show you, I'll show you another way of doing it in a moment. But the first way you can access the database with CodeIgniter, there's two ways you can really do it. One is to make the model class itself the data object, and we'll talk about what that means in a moment. So starting out with, we have our file name, Hoot user model. The underscore model, I think, is not mandatory, but the first letter has to be capitalized. Again, Hoot user model has to match the file name. This time we're going to extend CI model. So that's the first thing we do when we create our model. The next thing you can do if you want, or you should, is just make the constructor public function underscore construct, and then parent construct, and also we need to do this arrow load arrow database. This will initialize the database. Should you have a problem with the database configuration, this will throw the error at this point. So these the constructor and the class are the first things we set up for the model, and then we can move on to making the functions. Before I get to the functions though, let's talk about the public members I have here. So there's two ways of sending data in and out. One is to have an associative array with the column names as the key and the values of those individual elements in that array as the values for the data row. Or you can make the entire class the data object for your database. So here I have ID, user, password, email, first name, last name, and role FK. If you remember correctly, these are the names of my columns from my database. Let me go back to my database here. We'll click on users. Maybe. There we go. And ID, user, password. Do I have password? Yeah, password. And then, which we'll talk about password in a minute. Notice this is kind of weird. We'll explain what's happening here. We have email, and we have first name, and we have last name, and a foreign key for the role. So this is the way I'm going to set up for now. There is another way to do it, and it actually can be easier to do it the other way when you're doing the update. So what I'll probably do is I'll probably modify the update. I'll try to do it live here. We'll see what happens, but if not, I'll post on another tutorial. So right now, assume that your public member variables are going to be your column IDs. Now, whenever you create a model, you want to think two things. The first thing you want to think of is CRUD. So CRUD create, read, update, and delete. Those are the classic 4 options you need to have for a database: create an entry, read the entry, update the entry, and delete the entry. Now, before we go off hog wild and start making CRUDs here, let's think about it. Also, we want to think about abstraction. Now, admittedly, the point of the model is to get information to and from the database. But we also don't need all the functionality on all the query functionality of a database in our controller. Our controller is going to be looking at more abstract things, like maybe the last 10 hoots that were given, or the list of 100 users, or some such thing like that. It's not going to be as as grainy or as fine resolution as a SQL query, where I can literally search and combine any table in my database and get a different result or view. So we also want to think in terms of what is my controller going to need from this model. So this is where software engineering comes into play. I would recommend, in a normal situation, obviously we're learning this right now. We don't even know how to make a model, but in a normal situation, I would recommend having a pretty good idea of what kind of functions the controller is going to, or what kind of information the controller is going to want back from the database, and at what level of abstraction. So just the raw data, the query data, the result array directly, like I do, or maybe just the specific fields. I mean, how are you going to set this up? And so I'll show you the way I kind of go about it, but there are multiple levels of models. You'll see in C# and ASP that the model is literally just a pipe to a database, and the controller has to do a lot more as far as the parsing through the data. Here we can do a little more parsing here and send out just more of the data the controller is looking for, but there are different philosophies and different levels of abstraction. So these are the two things we're going to talk about. We're probably not going to make a complete CRUD. I'm not going to do delete right now, and I'll explain why. But yeah, so right in here I said CRUD. So, but this is a good place to start, and then also thinking about what kind of functions or what kind of information you actually need. So That said, we have public member variables that are the same name as the ID. Mind the capitalization on the PHP side. It shouldn't be a big deal once it gets to MySQL, but on the keys it will be internally to PHP. So first thing we want to do is maybe for a user, we want to be able to add a user. Now remember, I could technically do post here. I can if I want. So I can post from a form and I could grab the values. But remember, we don't want to do that. We want the model to take in values from the controller. We want the controller to do the parsing, the validation, and everything. So we're going to assume at the model that all this data is provided for us. We're not going to really worry too much about how it's getting here at the point, because the model's not concerned about that. The model's job is simply to read and write to the database and send data back. It's not really supposed to interact with the user. So here I have a very simple function set up with parameters, user, password, email, first and last. You say, well, wait, we're missing some fields. So the ID will be 0. The reason the ID is 0 is this is auto increment. So when we insert, and it's important only on insert, we can change just say send in a 0, and then whatever the next ID is, that will be the new ID for our user table. We can the role FK, I have hard coded the 2. So default, if we look at my table, my roles, 2 is a user, 1 is admin. So when you create a user, just by default, the user is just going to be a user and not an admin. So, and remember, this has to be a valid ID, otherwise you can't insert this to a user table. So here I'm basically assigning the parameters I sent in to the class member variables, user, password, email, first name, last name, and then setting my ID and role. Notice for password, it's common practice to MD5 the text. So this here is a plain text password. I put the plain text password in here, and I do MD5, and it makes it into a hash, which is what we saw here. This is why this is just actually to protect the web admins and the IT. So think about it. You're in a company, you have a very big important file, so a lot of sensitive information, and you lose your password. You go ask the IT guy, what's my password? Well, if the IT guy can go in here and he can see this, but he can't actually tell you what this was. So that means that he doesn't know what you wrote. He doesn't know what your password is. You can't write this in as a text field, because when you write this in as a text field, you're going to take the MD5 of whatever you write in and then compare it with this. So the best the IT guy can do is reset your password and let you retype the password and try again. This protects the IT guy, so when things disappear or someone gets illicit access, they can't point fingers at the IT guy and say, oh, well, he knew the password as well. So common practice, MD5, SHA-32, some sort of hashing of the password text field, just so that the IT guy and the MySQL web admin doesn't know what you typed here. In fact, I'm not sure what I typed here. I forgot what I typed here, so I think it was Bob, if I remember right. We'll look. So once I've set all of my elements in my object, this object, then I can do this DB for database, then insert the table I want to insert, and then I pass in this object. And this used to be called ActiveRecord, and then they changed the name to like Query Helper or QueryBuilder. So I will post a URL for this one, but this is a useful thing for you to look at, and they make it a lot easier so you don't have to memorize the SQL directly. You can send direct SQL queries into this system, so if you actually know MySQL really well, then you can do it that way as well. Now, the next thing we think about is a lot of times we are going to be dealing with user names and not necessarily know the ID. So we might want, this is where you have to think about, what kind of functions or abstraction do you want for your model. So I could see you'll see a very popular situation where the controller needs the ID of the user, not the name of the user, because the ID is what links the hoots and the likes back to the user. So what we do is we have a public function GetUserID. We send in the username. We're going to do a query, but it's not a real query. This is again a QueryBuilder, and we're going to say this db get where, and get where is the function you use to do a get where MySQL basically. The tables, and then you guessed it, an associative array of the conditions. So the key user points to the username we passed in. So where user is equal to this in tables users, get that result. And then I prefer, you don't actually have to do this part, but I prefer to do this because it gives you a nice 2D array to go through your data. We'll talk about this in a moment. So I prefer doing it this way than just doing directly from the standard object. If the size of the query is greater than 0, then we know it worked. Otherwise, we return false, and this is an invalid username. So here we can say return query. The first index of the 2D array, this is actually going to be a 2D array because it's a result array, is going to be which element of the query, which query you're going to use. Remember, you can possibly get multiple rows with a query. You're not necessarily going to get one row. Hopefully in this situation you're only going to get one row, but not necessarily in all queries. So the queries are set up for the first index to be which particular row you want to get, and the second one is going to be which field you want to get. In this case we want to get the ID. So again, the ID is the column name, ID, and then that column ID you got will be returned with the public function GetUserID. Now this is actually incorrect because actually no, this is not incorrect. So here's one situation where using the data object style can be a little bit difficult. For example, updating the user. So I want to update the user. I think in my example I changed the email address. In this situation, since my object has all the fields in it, I have to repopulate all the fields even if I'm not changing it. So here, this is kind of is one of those situations where the user would have to type in everything, or you have to get all the information from the user, populate the form, have the user modify it, and resubmit everything and basically change all the values. So we'll walk through this one, and then I think I'm going to try to do at the end of this video, I'm going to try to show you the other way of doing this. We'll see if I can get it to work. So user, password, email, first and last. I grab the ID from the user ID. So I don't know what my user ID is necessarily. So this ID equals this get user ID user. So this is why we just use this function here. And then if this ID is not equal false, that means the name exists. And obviously here is another no-no. I would never want to write anything in the model. I would want to throw an error and have my controller catch it or do something. But this is just for proof of concept. So here, if the ID is false, then the user's name is the password is MD5 of the password you typed. Email's email, first name is first, last name is last. Role FK will still be set to 2, and then we're going to do this DB update, the user table, and then the condition where you're going to update, or the data you're going to update this, the object, then the condition in the form of an associative array, so where ID is equal to this ID. So if I want to modify this, I have to specify where this ID is. Here is a danger though, be careful, you do have to set this ID. For those of you who are used to MySQL from the query perspective, you don't have to worry about ID. But because ID is a function here and or an element here in this object, if you don't set it and you update it, you will actually change ID to 0, which is a really bad thing in databases. So we don't want to do that. So but in this situation, I could change everything. Now you say, is that good or bad? Well, it's not as bad as it sounds, because you think about it. If you want the user to be able to modify his or her profile, you're going to bring up a view, you're going to populate the fields with the current data, and you're going to let them change whatever they want and resubmit it. When they resubmit it, you basically don't know which fields they have changed necessarily, so you're going to it's not a bad idea to update everything. I will show you, hopefully, like I said, in a moment, I will show you how to just update one field. At least I'll try. Now we can here's this. This is important, and hopefully this link will be on YouTube or in the YouTube video. If not, copy this down. The query builder. You want to read this. Consider it an assignment. It is very important, and this will make, for those of you who do not know MySQL, this is the godsend. This makes it possible. I'm not super keen on MySQL. I've taught it to myself several times. I don't use it frequently enough to have it memorized. But if you don't know MySQL, the query builder stuff is great. So definitely check out this website. Right now, I could do a couple different reads. For this read user, I'm just going to basically pass in the ID. So we're going to go this database get where from the table users. Again, the array associative array for the condition ID is equal to the ID I passed in. Send that query to a result array, and then just return this query. So I'm going to return this 2D array. Nothing really special and not super useful right now. I'll explain how we're going to get this ID value later on. What we're basically going to do is we're going to store the author's ID as a parameter and send it into the controller with a link. It's probably one way we're going to do it. So we're going to different ways we can get this value. Right now, this is not going to be that useful, except just showing you that it does work. And then we should have a delete user, which I have not implemented. I'm not going to at the moment. But I wanted to point out a problem with delete user. Remember, we have several foreign keys. So if I want to delete a user, everything that has a foreign key to the user table has to be deleted. So all the hoots, we remember the author FK, all the hoots written by the user have to be deleted first. Then, if we remember, likes also has a foreign key to the user FK. So all the likes have to be wiped out. And then, after I've done both of those things, then the user, him or herself, can be deleted. So deleting someone is not necessarily an easy thing, especially when you have foreign keys. If I just try to delete the user straight, I will get a MySQL error because the foreign keys will not let me delete something that's being used. So let's look at this real quick. We'll open up, okay, so the other thing I did is I created a user controller. Again, user controller extends CI controller. Nothing really fancy here except on my constructor. Again, pause the video if you need to, by all means. On my constructor, I call it parent constructor. I load the URL helper, which I don't actually use, I don't think. And then I'm going to load my models. So it's going to be this load model, Hoot user model. So it's going to be the name of the class without the .php. Likewise, the Hoot model, which we'll talk about later, and the Hoot-like model. And then once I've loaded these, I can use this thing as an element of my object, or in this case, this thing. So down here you see this Hoot user model. Now it's as if it's an element, and I can do add user. So bat was my password, it looks like. So let's change this. So we're going to uncomment this line. Oh. I don't know why I did block comments. So right now, this is going to Hoot user model read user 3. I'm going to see 3 here, so I'm going to get my old one back. Let's add someone new. Let's say Sam. His password will be Sam because he's not very smart on that. And we'll call Sam at sam.com. Sam and Sam. So not a very original individual. And then this should create the user, and then this should print user 3, which will actually be printing me, the array. So again, this read user is going to return a 2D array, and I'm going to use print R to see this array. So let's save. Save this, and let's refresh this. So first of all, let's go through the array. Notice it's a 2D array. So I have array index at 0. There's actually only one because there's only one ID of 3. So index at 0, that's the first dimension of the array. Then there's another array inside it. Index at ID is 3. Index at user is bTowle. Password is my password hash. Email is my email. First name Brad, last name Towle. Role FK is equal to 2. So it's a two-dimensional array. And normally you would never print this information out. This would be internal to your web application, so it actually is secure. I'm just showing you that it's working. The other step is, what about our user we tried to add? Let's go back to our database. We'll refresh the user table, and bada bing, here we are. We have ID 4, Sam, hashed password that we don't know what we typed or what he typed, and then an email, first and last name with a role. So that is how we can add someone to the table. Now, editing the table at the moment, we have to use an existing one. So let's uncomment this line. This Hoot user model update user. Remember, we wrote the function update user. It takes all the information again. This time I'm going to update my email address. I'm going to say b@b.com. And Brad Towle. So basically, I'm only updating my my email. So I save this. Again, this is going to be calling this function, the update user, and then I'll refresh it, and then this should print. This should get the new user, so this should actually print the changes. So refresh it, and now we look. My email is b@b.com, so it's changed it here. If we look at here and we update users, you'll see that I indeed did change my email. So that's showing you that the update is working. Now, one other way of doing this, I'm going to try. I might regret this. We'll try to do this live here. Bear with me if I have a couple mistakes. A public function update. Just say update name. I'm going to take first. Actually, we're going to take username. Yeah, no, we'll take ID. No, we'll take username. Why not? And we'll take first, and we'll take last. So often your session variable will either store your ID or your username or both. I prefer doing both, but we'll just say ID. This is not the object's ID. This is just a temporary variable. We'll say get user ID. We'll send in the username, and then we're going to say if ID not equal to false. Now here, instead of using the object as a way to pass it in, we should be able to say temp equal array. No, sorry, old school. Temp equal array. Temp first name equal $F. Temp last name $L. And then what we should be able to do now is say this, and I'm forgetting my $signs. This DB update users table, and instead of saying this, we're going to say temp, and we're going to say array where ID is equal to not this, but just ID. So now I'm only sending an object with 2 columns, and this should be accepted but this only limits what I can change to 2 columns. So if I go back to, so I save that, I'll copy this just for the heck of it. I go back here, and now instead of doing this function, I do this Hoot user model. I'm going to say update name. So Towle was my username. And I'll say Bradford, comma Towle Jr. There. So I'm going to update my name. Right now it says Brad Towle. I should update it to Bradford Towle Jr. So let's see what happens when I run this. It should work. Again, I haven't tried this out. So, oh, no. We have an error. Oh, I know I did wrong. And you see it does in fact work. So assuming I have the correct syntax, now my first name is Bradford, last name is Towle Jr. And instead of having to pass everything in and repopulate every column, I could use a temporary associative array, pass that in instead of the data object like I did down here, and I can update individual columns. So whichever one you use, it's up to you. This seems like a bad way to do it until you realize that a lot of times you're going to repopulate the fields anyway. And so a lot of times you're going to be receiving all the information regardless if it's been changed or not. This, however, if you know for sure I'm only changing the message, for example, our Hoot model, I'm only changing the message, this might be easier. This might be better, or maybe perhaps a like model. This might be the way to do it. So just food for thought there. There's 2 different ways to do the update. So for review, we've talked about configuring a database and creating and calling a basic model with CRUD functionality. So for problem of the day, what I want you guys to do is go ahead and try to make models for the hoots and the likes of our little example. For the Hoot model, I want to be able to insert a Hoot, update a Hoot, get the Hoot ID, read a specific Hoot via ID, and read the last 10 Hoots. For likes, I want to insert a like or create a like, modify a like, or just at least modify the rank. You don't have to worry, and a time modified. Get all the likes for a certain Hoot ID and get all the likes from a certain user ID. Now, for both of these, you'll have to look at date time, so that might be a little bit tricky. I'm going to go through these on the next video, but try to go through these and see how close you can get to what I have. All right, so we're going to continue this next lecture. We're going to work on the liked and the Hoot model just to kind of verify. But please work on that as a problem of the day and see how close you get. Thank you for watching, and until next time, cheers. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you learned something and enjoyed it. If you did, please leave a comment or a like below. And again, thank you.